Hi, this is Rick from edwurtle Software, and this is the training video for Poker Odds Calculator Pro. And in this video, I'm going to dive into details about the calculation mode, meaning the calculate to river, calculate to turn, calculate to flop, and calculate to pre-flop. So here, you just touch this button down here to change calculation modes. So, as I said before, the 4 different modes: river, turn, flop, and pre-flop. So this is the standard mode, is a calculate to river, and you use this mode whenever you want to perform normal calculations, meaning to figure out the percentages based on if played all the way to the river. So here it shows the 7-8 of diamonds has a 22.7% equity against the pocket kings when played all the way to the river. However, if you click on or touch the button down here to calculate to flop and calculate it, those odds drop to 6.0%. And that means 6.0% of the time, the 7-8 of diamonds will outflop the kings. In other words, like the 7-8 of diamonds will flop either like a flush or 2 pair or 3 of a kind, something to have a better hand than the kings 6.0% of the time. And you can also calculate to pre-flop. So let's do that here. And it shows the kings are always ahead against 7-8s pre-flop 100% of the time. And of course that makes sense. However, let's make a more useful case. Let's do pocket tens versus 2 random cards or a random player. Now this percentage is calculated to pre-flop also. However, it's more useful. It shows 98% of the time the pocket tens will be ahead against a random player pre-flop. Or to state another way, this player will have either pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket aces 2.0% of the time. And let's do another example for calculate to flop. Let's do tens versus 7-8 suited again. Now, the equity for the 7-8 of hearts is 5.4% on the flop only. And let's click this blue button here to dive into stats for the 7-8 of hearts. Now this is the typical hand rank breakdown stat. However, this is only calculated to the flop because that's the calculation we perform, calculate to flop. So the calculation to flop actually applies to all the stats. All of these stats here are all calculate to flop, and you can kind of see it because these cards are dark here. Just calculate to flop. So here it shows 41.2% of the time the 7-8 of hearts will flop a pair, some type of pair, and you can click on that and dive in and see that obviously most likely it'll flop pair of 8s or pair of 7s over any other pair. And if you're wondering, like, these pairs mean the board has a pair, so pair of queens on the board 1.3% of the time and so forth. And actually kind of interesting, the pair of tens only shows 0.23% of the time. It's a very small chance this player has a pair of tens. And that actually makes perfect sense because the other player has tens. So that kind of reduces the odds dramatically of this player ending up with a pair of tens. So in addition to the standard hand rank breakdown stat, when you have deal to flop, you get this other nifty stat. And this is only available for deal to flop, but it's basically the draw breakdown for that player. So here it shows, for example, the straight draw 24% of the time. 7-8 of hearts will flop some type of straight draw 24% of the time. To actually see what more details about that straight, because you might not be interested in the gut straights, you only care about the open-ended straights, you can touch there, and now it breaks down the straights to open-ended straights 8.3% of the time, and a double gut straight 0.5% of the time. You can even click on it to dive in further. And you can show that you'll be on the dummy end of the straight 1.7% of the time, the 10, 9, 8, 7. You'll be on the good end of the straight 3.2% of the time. And then in the middle of the straight 3.4% of the time. And also it shows you the flush breakdowns. So this is a 4 flush. He'll end up with a 4 flush 9.9% of the time. And here's all the kickers from the ace, high flush, and the most likely flush draw he'll have is a 8 high flush draw. And that makes sense because he has an 8 7 of hearts. So that shows you all the draw breakdowns, and here's some other ones like pair and a flush draw. Let's click on that to see it. You can see all the pairs and the flush draw, and let's zoom in here, see what stands out. And obviously the pair of 8s with a 4 flush is the most likely pair and 4 flush, where these two are. And you actually can click on that and see that the most likely 4 flush is 4 flush and pair is the pair of aces, pair 8s and an 8 4 flush draw. But they're all pretty much the same. So that's actually a useful feature. So if you want to see draw stats, you have to set this to calculate to flop and then calculate. But keep in mind, this 5.4% might not mean what you think it means. You might be thinking, oh, I only have 5.4% of the time to catch up. Well, that's not true. That's only the flop alone, because you calculate to flop. But in actuality, if you calculate all the way to the river, the 7-8 of hearts has a 19.1% equity in the hand. So those are some useful ways of using the calculation modes. Here's another useful calculation mode. Reason to use one. Let's change this to calculate to pre-flop. And simply let's do one player with no cards and dive into the stats here. So now we have calculate to pre-flop, which means don't use any board cards. It's just only the player cards. So here you can actually see with a random player will have a pocket pair 5.9% of the time. And you actually can dive in and click it to see the breakdown of all the pocket pairs. So 0.45% of the time you'll end up with a pocket pair of aces, which is kind of interesting. So almost 0.5% of the time you have pocket aces, which I normally don't end up with that good of luck, but that's what you should end up with. 0.5% of the time end up with pocket aces, or 0.45% of the time to be more precise. And you can actually dive into the high cards. So 14.5% of the time you'll have an ace high pre-flop, which the first time I calculated this, I thought that was kind of high. I didn't realize that's how often you have a pair of ace of some kind in your hand, 14.5% of the time. So that's kind of interesting. And you can also calculate against a lot of players. This is simulating odds, obviously. But so now you can actually look at the same stats you looked at before. They're very close, slightly off because they're approximate. But here you can actually just look at the pairs. And now since you're up against players, it's not all blue. It's blue and white and orange. But you can see the pair of aces obviously is all blue, while the further you go down, the white slices increase. So down to the pair of twos, let's turn off the loss and tie. So the pair of twos, 0.25% of the time, you'll have a pocket pair of twos and be ahead against 9 other players. However, 0.19% of the time you have pocket twos and be behind. So that basically means Pocket twos, about half the time with pocket twos, you'll be ahead against 9 players, but half the time, somebody else will have a better pair than you when you're up against 9 other players. So these kind of just interesting things to do with the deal2 feature. So again, to summarize, the calculate to feature, I just said deal2, but it's called calculate to. It basically fills in all the cars and it stops wherever this bar is. So if it's here, it stops here and doesn't fill in missing cars and doesn't care about board cars. So this is just pre-flop alone. And to calculate to river, calculates all the way to the river. And this is the odds if played all the way to the river. So if you're in doubt, always use calculate to river and only use the calculate to other modes, if you have a specific purpose. Like for example, if you want to see draw stats, use calculate to flop, or if you wanted to see who's ahead on the flop, use calculate to flop. However, standard calculations just always set it to calculate to river, and that will give you the results you're looking for. So that's the basics. But I also get the question, well, I understand calculate to river, and I use calculate to flop often, but I never use calculate to turn. Like when would that be useful? Calculate to turn. So I'll give you an example why that might be useful. Let's say you have 7-8, and you're against some type player. Let's say like a Skalansky 2 player, and you flopped an open-ended straight draw. However, a high card came out. Now the standard calculation, calculate to river, let's do that first. Against a type player with this flop, you have the open-ended straight draw, and you'll have equity about 35.8% of the time if played all the way to the river. However, suppose this type player down here, he always bets really big on the turn to the point where you're never going to make it to the river unless you hit the card on the turn. So in that case, this percentage is not that useful because this takes into account both the turn and the river. So instead, let's just tap this button and calculate to the turn only. And now it shows a lower number, 19.9% of the time, or almost 20% of the time, I'll hit that card or actually catch up to this player, because you might actually only need a pair depending on what cards they have. But you have lower equity if you only consider the turn. But that might actually be the more valuable equity to look at if you know this player will bet on the turn. Because if he bets on the turn and you miss on the turn, you're not going to make it to the river anyways. So that's another reason. That's a potential reason to use calculate to turn. So those are the calculation modes. And if you have any other questions, you can email me at support@edwurtle.com or visit the website edwurtle.com. And also check out all the other training videos I have for the Poker Odds Calculator Pro. Thank you.